Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and in this video I want to discuss Endgame in the Lord of the Rings Online, and in this context, like many MMORPGs, I refer to Endgame as content that you run once you get to or very near the level cap, and Endgame content allows you to go through a progression system to better your character with upgrades such as gear. So in the strictest sense, I think this can include solo content, but usually Endgame content does refer to specifically group content at the level cap. But what I am planning is actually a mini-series of videos discussing various aspects of Endgame and Endgame content in LOTRO as we start heading into the year 2021. But I decided it would be best to give an overview of Endgame in LOTRO, and that will be the first video, the first part here. So this will be a little bit guide-like actually, because I plan to let you all know of all the things surrounding Endgame and LOTRO and what you need to do for Endgame. And just briefly, I will also bring up all the topics, each of which could be further discussed in future parts. But back to this part, I will be covering endgame content and group content in general in LOTRO, then I will shift to talking about the different systems of endgame, and then I will bring up some of the good and bad aspects as I continue reviewing endgame content. And of course, with the review parts of this, it will be more of my opinion, but I also will be drawing that from what I have seen from the broad community opinion of endgame and LOTRO. But before we do jump into the overview, I want to mention that I have made a few polls recently, one here on YouTube, one on Reddit, which gave me a surprising amount of insight, and one on Twitter to try to find out what the community thinks of Endgame. And I will be drawing some aspects from community feedback based on those, and I do want to thank everyone that participated in those. That will all be helpful going forward. And I would also love for you all to share your thoughts on Endgame and LOTRO in the comments, no matter what type of player you are. Any input on that will be greatly appreciated. But now that that is out of the way, let's get into LOTRO's Endgame. For the first part of this first part, I want to talk about the actual content for Endgame and LOTRO and just group content in general. Of course, this is going to be super subjective, but I love group content in LOTRO. I think many instances and raids are designed well, and I really love the way the different classes play and interact with each other to create a super fun setup for going into the group content. And this setup is also favorable for players to play alts and go through group content with what can be wildly different experiences, say as a defensive melee tank versus a ranged support or spellcaster as an example. So throughout LOTRO's histories, raids have been widely varied in terms of difficulty and how long it takes to run them, but more recently there have been more longer multi-boss raids that start fairly difficult at the first tier of difficulty. Then on top of that, they have more tiers for more challenge and reward. But in some even more recent changes with War of Three Peaks in Update 28, the baseline Tier 1 for the level 130 raids was made easier and is a lot more manageable for, say, casual or less geared and less well-built groups. Also, War of Three Peaks introduced the first raid in many years that is fairly short to complete with only 2 bosses and limited trash fights. I think that shift is a good thing because it means Endgame is more inclusive of more players, and higher difficulty tiers still allow for more challenge, more mechanics, and of course more reward, which is always fun for those interested in that. So I think there are many players who want to participate in group content and would find it a fun experience, but for Endgame and LOTRO, a lot of these players do not end up ultimately participating in the group content, and they may even stop playing the game before or when they get there. So having said that, I think there are more steps needed to get players interested in running group content, or at least make their time better trying to run group content. In LOTRO, there is a ton of grinding and a ton of content required for you to finally get to endgame and be able to participate. And I think a lot of players, especially casual players, just never get to experience endgame because they get bored or turned off from the grind and just don't play the game maybe long enough to get through all the levels and content to get to the cap and get to endgame and just having that experience. But then even if they do get to endgame, players may run into many other issues such as extra expanses that come along with purchasing the latest content or expansions on top of whatever they already pay for the game, or maybe they just see too much of the LOTRO store, or cash shop as it is popular called, being thrown in your face too frequently and get bothered by that, or maybe even their class or spec is being neglected and not good enough to run through group content with, and they could even run into issues with pugs and not getting invited. And on that note, you could even have trouble finding a kinship that you can fit in with. And the list keeps going on here, but the point that I'm trying to make is I just think there are many reasons for players to not participate in group content. And again, all of that is what I want to break down and discuss in the bulk of this video. So let's shift into the more guide-oriented section of this video on all of the endgame systems in LOTRO. To start off, there are 3 core character progression systems that are important leading up to endgame while leveling and also in endgame content. First off, there are class trait points. These are very important to your character's power, and you get them through various methods. I actually already made a whole video on this topic, but right away here we are jumping into what is my least favorite thing about LOTRO. I'll direct you to that video on this topic for more details, but I think the way you get trait points is fundamentally flawed because you have to go through a lot of specific quests, deeds, and book quests, while others you also get through class deeds and just by leveling for a few and even a few other random things. But again, these are important to your character's power, and certain point thresholds are quite important to certain classes or specs performance in in-game content, and meeting those thresholds can be very impactful to your character's viability in endgame. But moving on, the second is virtue traits, which as of this video there are 72 virtue levels, and for the most of the levels the cap is half your character's level, but virtues boost various stats for your character, and virtues you don't have equipped give some passive boost. And to level these you get virtue XP, mostly from deeds like zone and slayer deeds, but also some other weekly activities can reward virtue XP, and virtues are definitely helpful and necessary for higher difficulty tiers, but not quite as meaningful as class traits overall. And the third and last long-term character progression system is legendary items, and more specifically at level 100 plus there is the imbued legendary item system, which is a whole game in itself. While us players are hopeful a revamp is still in the works, we still have to deal with the system as it is in the meantime, and grinding up your imbued legendary items are necessary for your character's damage or healing or like some defensive oriented stats for tanks. But yeah, these are important, but let's go into talking about the different aspects of legendary items. And the first of the main 3 is the primary stats such as tactical damage rating, weapon DPS, or healing rating, incoming healing, or just something along those lines, the main stat of your LI. And getting your LI's damage boosted with Starlit Crystals is also even very important for solo content. Another aspect is the legacies, which require you to get the right ones before you imbue your LI, or get relatively expensive imbued legacy replacement scrolls to replace them after you imbue. But especially for some classes, legacies have major impacts on your character's performance. Other classes or specs sometimes actually get very little or no benefit from legacies even. So because of that, it may even be very confusing for beginners or casuals to know what is going on for their class/spec. And finally, the third main aspect is the relics, which are typically replaced with whatever is the latest content in LOTRO. These often provide valuable and noticeable stats for your character. So overall, I think legendary items provide a very complex and intimidating system, which are very, very important to your character's power level, save for a couple of very specific scenarios, very specific specs. But even for high-level solo content, a strong legendary weapon will be necessary at least. Alright, so as you all hopefully see, these 3 systems are very important to your character's progression, not only at endgame, but also while you work your way towards it. These 3 systems provide just very large barriers for players to overcome before they can comfortably get into endgame content. But what about after that, like once you actually have all these things set up for your character? Well, there are a few other endgame systems you need to get familiar with and progress through for your character, all while still keeping up with these previous systems I just talked about. And the first one here, perhaps the most obvious, is gear. Most landscape gear will have you set for entry-level group content, but gear ranges in quality and item levels with the idea that harder content gives better gear. Usually gear drops directly from the group content, and some entry-level pieces are also usually barterable from different reputation factions for some type of landscape currency. And the second here is essences, which endgame gear has sockets for these essences, which have stats that you would typically find on gear such as vitality, mastery, mitigation, and etc. But essences also range in terms of quality and item level, and also they have various sources, such as boxes that drop directly from group content, or they may be crafted or even bartered for. On top of regular essences, there are also trigger essences though, which those can only be obtained from like certain difficulty levels in the content, and they have their own limitations and mechanics on top of all that. And then the third is loot boxes. As sad as it is for me to say that, loot boxes can give you entry level gear. And moving on, the fourth is with currency, specifically Embers of Enchantment I am referring to. And most endgame gear can be broken down for this endgame currency. Even the max level loot boxes can give you some embers, and another source of these is like weekly quests. But these Embers of Enchantment can be bartered for essences, legendary item scrolls, and crystals, which have a max tier level, so they can't even fully max out your LIs with those. And then the embers can also be bartered for gear boxes that once again have entry-level gear pieces. So those are the endgame systems, and to get all of that stuff, there's a various mix of weekly quests, daily quests, deeds, crafting, and actual content like instances and raids that we talked about. But I hope that rundown was actually helpful, first of all, but a big point I have here is there's a ton of grinding involved in all that, not only to get to endgame, but also once you are at endgame, and to get where you can comfortably run and get invited to participate in the group content at endgame. And it really is crazy, and I think a big turnoff to players with all that. And on top of all that, you have to level through 130 levels worth of content, which I will say it's a good thing that there is a lot of content in the game, but you have to go through that lot of content to get to endgame, which is very daunting, especially for new players who may have an interest in eventually getting to running endgame content. But if we go back to my polls that I mentioned earlier, the results have shown the biggest reason other than leveling that people do not run group content is because of the grinding involved to get there. And I think this makes group content too inaccessible for a good chunk of LOTRO players, which I think is sad because, again, I think the group content is very good in the game. I think many players could enjoy it but never get to experience it because of these barriers. By now we have covered the endgame content and the system, so I have shared my thoughts on most of what comprises an in-game experience in a game, but I still do have a few things to talk about. And first, I want to talk about the players, the in-game community in LOTRO. To keep it short, it can be difficult for beginning in-game players to get invited to run group content or even find a kinship to run with. Many long-term players don't want to deal with a non-geared and potentially poorly built character and similar with kinships, because this can just lead to trouble for them clearing content and just not be as quick and as efficient as it could be. And on top of that, these in-game players also don't want to run with non-meta classes and specs. And I think the broad in-game community probably has some good justifications for this. So I'm hoping this isn't coming across completely criticizing them, but I think this ultimately sets up an environment where it is hard for players to get into endgame even after managing to grind their way through all these barrier systems. And I personally have experienced this in the past. At this time, I am fortunate enough to have a wonderful kinship on a Nor, and am relatively new to a kin that I was invited to partially because of my content creation from a viewer on Arkenstone, and I'm able to casually enjoy endgame content with them. But definitely not all players are going to be that lucky. But moving on, I just brought up and have alluded to many times this endgame meta. Basically, this is the setup of roles and classes and specs players use to run through endgame content. Anything outside of this meta is usually cast off for group content because something in the meta can perform that role better. But back to the community, if endgame group is looking for a player, why would they accept a character that does not fill the role well versus a character that does? For example, if somebody wanted to DPS as a minstrel, a redline minstrel, groups would not take them because there are a few more valuable DPS classes, DPS specs to take. And I think there are a few issues going on here that ultimately make endgame less appealing. The first is that not all specs are viable. Another example is a Redline Guardian. While I and many other players may find the spec fun, you will not be accepted to group content as a Redline Guardian specifically for the DPS role. And this can be a major turnoff for players that did all this work on the character just to find it as a meta class or spec, and now they can't run endgame content. But another issue here is that most specs and classes are actually good enough for the new tier 1 at least, but I have found this mindset to be stuck in the community that they can only run with the meta and can't take anything different even if the content is pretty easy enough for it. And perhaps this is even just a trend in gaming in general, because I see this in games outside of LOTRO, where everything is so focused around a meta, where again, even sometimes the content definitely doesn't require you to be a part of like whatever that meta is. But one more example I do have to share with y'all here is if you maybe love the blue line on your hunter and don't find the other specs as fun. Well, the current meta as of this video, you are expected to run in the red line, and basically that player that perhaps likes the blue line hunter will get demotivated, not only pursuing endgame content, but perhaps LOTRO as a whole. And I bring up this specific example because it is actually something I've heard from more than one person that they have tried, and even specifically with this class and spec, they like the blue line hunter and have a lot of fun leveling on it, but they don't like the kind of standstill part of red line hunter and don't like the L line hunter. So they just like stop playing the game when they get to the end game because they can't play blue line hunter because it's not viable and no group will actually take them. But the point here is that even though I think the diversity of roles and synergy created by different endgame setups is fun and exciting thing, like I mentioned earlier, I think that the balance in some designs here also set up an environment that is unappealing to many players, and it's another thing that pushes them away from endgame and LOTRO. And it definitely even does impact me. Like, I would probably play my ults, be more motivated to get my ults up if I didn't have to worry about them fitting the meta or playing a specific spec on them that fits the meta. But that is all I have here in my further reviews section for this video. So we have finally covered all the topics of the video, and I want to give a quick summary. First, we overviewed endgame content in LOTRO and explained why I think it is fun, basically. And second, I gave a rundown of the different endgame systems and talked about why they are grindy and create large barriers to entry for endgame content. Third, we covered the endgame community in LOTRO for the beginner endgame player. And lastly, I shared some other turnoffs of endgame content for LOTRO players. Again, I do want to remind everyone that this is part 1, and I plan to expand many of the topics in future videos in their own concentrated parts. I just kind of brushed over everything to bring it up as a topic here. But the goal, again, was to give an overview of all these different aspects of endgame and LOTRO. That said, if you have any comments, feedback, or input on endgame and LOTRO, please do share in the comment section, or on the video. I would also like to hear that. I do look forward to reading all that, but otherwise, I hope you all have enjoyed this video and learned about endgame and LOTRO. And if you did, please consider liking or subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content, and thanks for watching, everyone.